My Aunt Marion Nelson has been missing for 4 decades. She was 14 when she went missing, and to suggest that a girl of that age in the early 80s simply ran away and decided to make a life for herself elsewhere in the country, I don't believe is a believable narrative. The other narrative, which is the whispered sort of narrative, which is that she was killed by the man who was known as her promised husband. I've grown up with a Warlpiri mother from the community of Yuendamu and a white Australian father from Newcastle, New South Wales. I've been a cross-cultural educator along with my parents for over 20 years, and there is a lot of talk. There is a lot of talk amongst our political leaders, amongst certainly people of Indigenous heritage in this country about the idea of truth-telling. But I suspect that idea is more about pushing that narrative onto the rest of Australia. The rest of Australia has to somehow repent for the sins of the past, even though the rest of Australia, like us now, weren't there when those things happened. My idea of truth-telling is to understand the complexities of all of it. If you look at traditional Aboriginal culture compared to Western culture, you're not encouraged to question anything or, use constructive criticism to understand better why we do things as human beings within our culture. You're just told this is how we've done things for over 60,000 years, and that's why you have to keep doing it and don't ask questions. And I guess so, having that coming from those two different backgrounds, the Western side of me says we need to start asking questions because our situation isn't improving.
Kuulunga Opargo Dat namilya ponga Yano no Pakanet Walgorolong.
I was born and raised at Yuendamu, a place called Yuendamu, on the edge of the Tanami Desert, and I was born under a tree. And I came from a family of 12. I'm the third youngest, and out of the 12, there's just 2 of us left. My mum and dad lived with these other families. They were a group family, all kin to each other. They all lived, we'd have 3-4 families living in the one area. But one of my relatives, an uncle's daughter, happened to be promised to a skin brother, and one of the nights he came looking for her and came and got hold of her and grabbed her, and she was kicking and screaming and didn't want to go. And I could hear her screaming and carrying on. I was so young, I was just wondering, so scared for her, worried for her. And everybody just accepted that, it's the norm. That's our culture, that's our tradition. If you have a promised wife, you have the authority, to do what you have to do with her. And so she's dragged off during the night. And I woke up the next morning and I saw her drag marks all the way to where he lived. And I was so I was saddened by it. I just think that's what made me realise, if that's what promised husbands do, I don't want to be part of that.
I don't know. I was young. What happened? Pun gua jan nyuruh je pakare ja. Ini kang promise.
I only realised later what it was all about, being promised and expecting to go and live with your older sister. I think it was when I was 11, and at that time I was more interested in going to school, getting the education. And I didn't think it was a good idea because what happened, you're supposed to go and live with your promised husband knowing that he's married to your older sister and you're expected to live with them and gradually become the second wife. I knew when the sun set, that my sister would come looking for me, expecting me to go with her. But I'd go and hide. I'd go and hide up a tree or on the roof, or just climb somewhere and get away from them as quickly as I could. That's became annoying for them, and I just kept doing it. And then I think my dad just realised and said, "No, we can't. She won't give in. I'd much rather let her go and get herself, go get educated and then come back."
Saya jajal pernah. Una jangat. Nyina jal pernah ngurangal.
My Aunt Marion Nelson has been missing for 4 decades. There are lots of different stories around her disappearance. There are stories claiming that she is alive somewhere in the country and has a family. But I don't believe that. And a lot of the women, particularly in my family, don't believe that.
She was promised to a man who already had a wife, and they were both taken to an ad station. He took her, the family took her to an ad station where they left her with him, and she ran away. She ran away and hasn't been seen or heard from. That's the story. Nobody knows where she is. And she's been missing since the 80s.
The women in my family tell me that she didn't want to be forced to marry this man because, what 14-year-old girl wants to be forced into a marriage to begin with? And on top of that, he had murdered his first wife and had gone to jail, had done jail time for that murder.
I've heard women in our family whisper to me what had happened, what they believe has happened to her. What they've said to me is because she ran away from her husband, from a promised husband, she disrespected the promised husband, and what people have said was that they killed her and left her buried out there in a country south of Yuendamu.
55% of Australians who identify as Indigenous have children with people who don't identify. 55% across the whole country. And it ranges from well over 80% in our southern capitals and the whole state of Tasmania, down to about 8% across the whole of the Northern Territory. The reason for that's simple, and because in the cities and down south, a lot of people who identify as Indigenous are physically, culturally and linguistically indistinguishable from their neighbours. Up here, people are very distinguishable.
I was born in Yuendamu in 1989. And then when I was 6 months old, my father relocated to Newcastle with the family. The culture clash was just too much for my mother, Runa, and that going on. So then she's moved back to Alice Springs with my siblings. And my father, then he struggled a little bit, but then he remarried a couple of years later to a Filipino woman. So I was actually raised by a Filipino woman. We have a good relationship. I call her mum. She calls me son still. So that's really good to have. And I've got 2 sisters from her. So I actually grew up in the Warlpiri community, the Filipino community in Newcastle, New South Wales, and the White Australian community. So yeah, it's been diverse.
My wife comes, I think, or we both think, from the culture in the world most different from mine. And that's very obvious to us every day in our 40 years of marriage. Her first language is utterly different from mine. And I've tried for 40 years to learn it, and it's tough.
If I found the difference with, say, my family's experience, like my family being Warlpiri, and then my family, say, being, very white Australian on the east coast of Australia, Newcastle, Sydney, that sort of thing, I'm finding that how interesting it is that my family, even though we're very like, you're part of this family, you're part of this group, how much that there is an underlying empowerment of the individual there. So like I've got my first cousin there, he's actually trans, and it was interesting for me growing up, watching him and her journey, and having that conversation to my family, like, oh, how do you actually feel about that? It wasn't to criticize anyone. I was just having an honest conversation about, like, how was it for us traditionally and what's going on? Like, how do you feel about this? And they said, he's family and we love him. That's it. I was like, wow, that's so amazing to think about that. Whereas, it's so funny on the East Coast, like it's such a controversial issue and people really talk about this big issue.
They know nothing about traditional culture. A lot of these people know nothing. They certainly don't live by it. And yet they are put up on this pedestal as, oh, you've got Indigenous ancestry, therefore you must know about this. And so governments listen to them. I think it's outrageous. This really bothers me because it's not going to solve the problems. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
When it comes to being politically correct and, individuals attempting to present themselves as being non-racists, if you like, it can be very condescending, as the assumptions being made that somehow these behaviours like constant acknowledgement to country and barefoot earthing ceremonies and that all that sort of thing is somehow what Aboriginal people want. And it's just as condescending as assuming that all Aboriginal people collectively think as a group. We don't.
Imagine someone from Sydney moving to Alice Springs is what you see a lot. And then they say, oh, well, this is the way we have to treat all these Aboriginal people now. This is how they are. This is how they think. So obviously we're going to turn and go, no, you don't. You don't know. And it's just like someone from, say, Yuendamu going to Sydney. They're not going to rock up to the block in Redfern and go, okay, well, this is what you got to do now. This is how you are. This is how you're going to feel. And this is the rules I'm going to implement. Of course, they're going to tell them to go, where.
I've had white friends in my childhood, and like godparents. Many friends. And they've always there for me and that, and support me. I've got like American parents, mother-in-law and that, and their family, and we get along, and I don't see any racism between their side of the family. Like, it's got to move on and not look in the past, and complain and whine about it, but we could learn from it,
I'm told often by those who disagree with me that, not all Aboriginal people agree with what you say. And I think it's particularly condescending when I've had white people say to me, yeah, well, not all Aboriginal people agree with you, Jacinta. And I say, I say, well, not all white people agree with you, and what's your point? There's this notion that somehow you have to think exactly the same.
People get very confused about what I look like, and then I have this accent because I lived in Sydney, So there's being in universities a lot, so I've got this type of accent going on. So when people meet me, I get it. University, institutions, everything, where I'm meeting other Aboriginal people, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, you're really brown." And I'm saying, yes. Like, my mother is full-blooded Wadfree. Like, what are you expecting? And they're like, you just sounded really white. I'm like, why do you have to sound or be or anything? I even had an individual at another university where they were telling me, well, until, you look so black to me, but then as soon as you told me that, you were educated in all these other things and your dad's white, I saw you differently now. I saw you as not really like another Aboriginal person. So I'm going, what is going on that I feel like now we're at that point where we've got to really start going, who's calling the shots, who's drawing the line, and who is making the rules on all of this stuff and what's going on, because it's just becoming a mess.
There is no record of my aunt's disappearance. There isn't a coroner's report around her disappearance. As far as I know, there's no evidence to suggest that she is alive and out there somewhere. I mean, it would be a miracle if, in fact, that's what we came to learn through this process. I want to understand, is it because we're that imprisoned by our traditional law, customary law, so much so that we have to be part of the cover-up of a young girl's murder. And as far as I am aware, she hasn't been reported missing.
So there's lots of ways to report. So obviously in the Northern Territory now we have mandatory reporting for child abuse and for domestic violence. The reports can be made for child abuse, they can be made through the Central Intake Child Abuse Hotline. They can be made direct to a police station, front counter, or ringing 000 or the 131 444 number. Reports are made by families themselves, by health clinics, schools, members of the public, other members of community. And same with domestic violence. You'll get a lot of mandatory reports that get reported through from the hospital from people who have sustained injuries.
I think when police try to investigate circumstances like this one, I think they're often met with a wall of silence, especially if there's a level of cover-up taking place.
Nobody has said anything about her disappearance. Nobody wants to say anything because they will be threatened.
Some of the main problems are the fear of payback. In domestic violence incidents, it can be fear of payback from the perpetrator themselves or the perpetrator's family or extended family, and sometimes from their own family because they don't want the trouble of police coming in and asking them for statements and information and being, getting involved in their family life.
For those who feel like they know the truth, there is always fear that there's a number of things they could receive. There could be violent retaliation against them. They could suffer at the hands of those who are trying to keep this quiet.
There's a lot of personal factors which involve shame, like family shame, the victim's family, depending on their age and which family they're from, and whether the family wants that incident reported and known. There's language barriers with police, there's trust issues about reporting things and not understanding the processes of reporting to police and then the court process that follows.
One of my cousin, sister, would call the cops. One of the family member would tell him to run down the river to hide from the cops. And Marty would be there giving evidence and what had happened. And they would go look for him and that, but he would go far away and just waited till the cops go and then come back and bash my auntie up again, just over and over. And it's really sad how I dealt with seeing that sort of stuff going on and on. And she had no one there, like everyone just turned their back on her, you know.
My oldest brother, my relationship with him was always visiting him in jail growing up. You know, looking back, I didn't realize every time I came to visit, I was always at jail visiting my brothers. I had a sister that was murdered by her husband, who got 7 years because his defense was, I didn't mean to kill her, even though they found the bloody knife in his bed that he stabbed her with.
Living with my partner, I've lived with him for 17 years. My second partner, third partner. Second partner was he was a Luritja man. He played in the bands. He was so violent towards me. He was he was with his wife, and then he'd come out to Yundum and stay with me maybe for a week, and then go back to his wife, and then to come back to me when he's drunk and wanted to beat me up. He stabbed me. He tried to stab me in my neck, but I saved myself by blocking.
Some of the women, they can be afraid for things they don't want to do or what they don't want to hear. Things maybe they go through violence.
A uniform crew will always attend in the first instance for domestic violence incidents, and they will attend and assess the situation. If there's a domestic violence victim that has sustained injuries, obviously St John's would get called and the victim would be taken to the hospital to be examined, canvass the area for witnesses, find out who rang it in, other people in the house. And a lot of the situations where the victim has been assaulted, they quite often don't want to make a statement because they are scared.
And it's just 4 of us, 4 women, and always get picked on at Yundamu community by Walbury men who are supposed to be our protectors. They don't protect us. They want to kill us. They use black magic. They say, oh, you do this. You go and tell a person about what's going on. We're going to kill you by black magic. And a lot of people have passed away in my community, in my tribe. A lot of people have passed away because of black magic, men threatening women.
In traditional Aboriginal culture, any premature death or illness is caused through sorcery or black magic, if you like. And it is often used also in terms of payback. You know, if you've done something wrong, a sorcerer can take your life for it. And as far as I'm concerned, I see it as another form of control, to control people, but nowadays especially, and probably in the old days too, to control women mostly, you know, unruly women who aren't going to behave themselves and behave like the good little wives and know their place.
What I get angry about is that when a husband dies, women are supposed to mourn the husband for 5 years until they're given permission by the uncle of the deceased husband to be allowed to become a normal person again, to be freed of her obligations. And yet when males pass away, when females pass away, I don't see any men mourning their death for the 5 years.
So walking out there, trying to feel a sense of her presence as well. And, you know, I'm looking around and I'm going, I'm wishing, I'm hoping to see I'm hoping to find her. I'm hoping to see something that resembles her. I'm looking, searching for bones. While I'm out there. And I can't rest until I feel like I have to. And we might not ever find her. So I have to come to terms with that at the same time.
But every time I'd say I'd leave him, he said he'd kill himself or take Michaela away from me, that I'd never see Michaela again. But then accident happened. He hung himself. And I felt sad just for a little while. And in my feeling, I felt, oh, I'm free. This means I have to go back home to my family, back to Yundamu. Then I had to stay another 4 years with his mum, because his family said that I killed him, that I hung him.
You know, there's no doubt that Aboriginal women have had very important and critical roles, and in some areas a great deal of authority. But overall they've been, their role is secondary to that of men, and violence against women is built into the culture. So, you know, the Ngara Law document that was published in the NT Law Journal in 2011, that Junga elder said straight out, he listed the cultural crimes that both women and men could be executed for, either physically or through sorcery. But then he went on to say that if women entered a particular camp, men-only camp, they could be taken away, virtually imprisoned, and subjected to involuntary sexual activity for perhaps months. Now, I don't think you need a great deal of imagination to understand what that means.
There needs to be more interaction between the men in communities to talk about these issues, because nobody talks about it. There's no communication between men in these communities to talk about these issues.
And I've talked to Aboriginal men about this, and like when the old chairman of the CLC, when the police car drives onto the ceremonial ground at Lajamano back in, when was that, 2007 or something like that. There was outrage, and, you know, all the activists went off automatically all around Australia, and it was on the ABC, and, you know, this shows no respect for Aboriginal law because there was a woman in the car. And the then chairman, he's since passed away, but he was a friend of mine, a man that I have a great deal of respect for because he was so honest. He was honest. And he said if that had been an Aboriginal lady, she would have been killed, simple as that. Now, that's on the ABC News. No reaction. It was there on my TV. I'm sitting there watching it. Well, this is something we all know, but he's had the guts to say it. And local feminists told me, yes, they tried to object and tried to get onto the news, but were cancelled. They weren't allowed to talk about it.
I've been confronted by women who said, "Oh, Best Price, you always, you know, you make out as if our men are mean, horrible." And what I've said to them is that no, what I'm trying to do is, if this man loves this woman, you know, find another way of, you know, dealing with your issues. You know, if you love her, you know, treat her like you first met her. That's what I want to say to these young men. Go back to the day you met her the first time and you showed her that love. Bring that love back.
You can't tell me that women are threatened with death like that, and yet that has nothing to do with the skyrocketing levels of violence against women in Aboriginal culture. What, there's no connection? I mean, Come on. No, you've got to blame the white man. You've got to call it lateral violence. You've got to call it, people are so traumatised by the loss of land and dispossession and blah, blah, blah. Rubbish. All of that makes things worse, yes. And the demoralisation and the trauma that's associated with colonisation, I'll accept that made it worse. But what people anywhere on earth, anywhere else, will say, you have caused my problems. You have taken my land from me. You have persecuted me, therefore I'll kill my wife.
If the violence from men has been happening for so long, well, yeah, I think we need to be pulling up our socks as well and also help pushing that, supporting each other. There's like a really cool talk I saw once, I can't remember the name of it, but she was saying, like, if we talk about men in the past taking women's power away, that doesn't make them powerful. That's just the illusion. They're still on the same level that they were. So we need to be helping each other right now to become powerful.
We all know these young men. We know their history. We know who their parents are and, you know, what upbringing they've had. And some of them are young, good young men. But they've got no direction, no support, no uncles standing beside them to guide them. This is what's missing.
Especially the young fellas, they just need role models. There's, you know, it's fair enough they've got sport people, but there's no push to go show what other Aboriginal men out there are doing. There's actually really incredible list of men doing so many different things.
And I often say to my young men, treat your woman like you love her. Don't beat her up. And most of them listen to me. But this is the talk that needs to take place in these communities. To talk openly about it. Not just pretend that it's, you know, it doesn't exist.
There needs to be other ways of being able to deal with these circumstances. And there are communities who are finding ways of mediating these circumstances in communities so it doesn't escalate to violence. But I feel like, certainly since being more vocal publicly, that there is a shift taking place and more people are talking openly about these issues.
Ngene nambi nil pa kareja parla yang gajupakan sekolah nga menyang watinge will preja nanga jo breakfast room janga nambi ne jel penyina jenjer wapal kin pananga jit will preja na yanuna will preja na yanuna jo nyet wate ngajokora yan jano nolba ngajokora yo kajana yan jere lanne nambi ni palkal pajana jenjer yano no jo naraje wangaja ngej pakal nokoro in jere breakfast room la inside ngajarat pana kareja kata cupakan pulangan.
Earlier this year, a young girl in my family, she had reported to police that her father had raped her from between the ages of 13 to 16, and she went to my cousin to tell her what had been happening, and my cousin assisted her to make the report to police and was also a witness at the trial.
You know, when you go to court and hear a girl in her mid-teens tell that court she was raped by her own father, and when you know that her aunt, maternal aunt, another mother, Aboriginal way, is attacked with an axe because that woman supported her niece, her daughter, Aboriginal way, when she went to the police and to the courts. There should be a stronger word than hero for that little girl.
This young girl, I believe, was incredibly brave to do what she did, to come forward She had clearly had enough. And I sat through the court with my mum and dad to support her through this case. And even her young cousin, who was 13, gave evidence as a witness as well.
If you sit and think about yourself, about, anyone sat down and thought about their first sexual experience, be it a good one or a bad one, and then you were asked to turn to a complete stranger sitting next to you and describe it to them, you would feel, you wouldn't want to, you'd feel very shocked or, I guess, very shy about it and reserved. And this is what we're asking these people to do, and especially young children. They've been through one of the most traumatic events of their life, and we are, as strangers to them, going out and asking them to trust us and tell us that story in as much detail as they can.
And I remember seeing the video playback of the 13-year-old giving her evidence, but being cross-examined at the same time.
We have what's called a vulnerable witness room in the court now, and we do pre-record. So in relation to sexual assaults for adults and children, we'll get the victim in before the court date and they will do a pre-record. So they will sit in the vulnerable witness room. So there's the lawyers and the judge, and the defendant sits in the court. The victim will sit in a vulnerable witness room and give their evidence, so they're not facing their attacker face to face. And it's pre-recorded, and then when the trial date's set down, that's played to the jury. So the victim doesn't have to attend the court at all. So there's no risk of running into the perpetrator if they're on bail, and no risk of running into their family.
When a kid, like a 13-year-old, is being cross-examined about witnessing the rape of her cousin, I know defence lawyers have to do their job, but you can't help but feel like it's wrong. It's wrong that this child has to go through this to begin with.
There wasn't a journalist in the court. The only two women, well, there were three women in the court. One was a Nyunga, middle-aged Nyunga woman who was studying law. She was very concerned. She was on board. The other was a white woman in police uniform, and the other was a white woman who works for the Department of Justice. They were the only ones there to support that girl. There were no journalists, there were no activists. The activists that we see sitting in court supporting Aboriginal male perpetrators, none of them were there.
And my cousin, who had been the witness, who had assisted her niece to come forward and report to police, she was threatened. She was attacked by the perpetrator's brother, who was the uncle of the victim. And it was his mother who encouraged this attack, the grandmother of the victim that encouraged this attack on my cousin, because she dared bring her son to justice for the crimes he committed against his own daughter.
We've quite often had victims and witnesses brought to town that have been threatened prior to court cases and then assaulted after court cases for giving that evidence. There is quite a lot of fear from victims, especially the younger ones, as a result of that.
None of the certain families don't want to talk about it, or like they get threatened or bashed up over speaking the truth out.
My cousin is still, she's now gone through court, and her attacker has now received a 10-year sentence. But she's not through the woods yet. There will always be a threat looming over her because of the fact that she stood up for her niece and she stood up for herself.
I also want to hear the voices of those in the background Aboriginal men who are also disgusted by what's happening and want it to stop. But because of their culture and because of their training, they see it as somehow betraying their own people if they stand up and say, no, we've got to stop killing our women. Men have said that to me, but it's always in private and always, don't tell that I said that because they can cop it.
Since moving into the domestic violence unit, we've taken on a role now where if people have domestic violence orders and they're going to expire, we get a notification, we get a list every week. So we look through and see if they've got a significant DV history or a DV history that's more than just the one that put the order in place, and we make contact and renew those orders so that they continue to be in place. And that way, if something does happen, then we've got the grounds straight away to do something about it rather than having to start from scratch and get another order.
The argument has been put forward by some groups that when it comes to child protection, that, you know, grandmothers should be able to have 15 kids sprawled out on mattresses in their home, and that's their idea of caring for children. Or, you know, we don't do things the white fella way, we do it this way. And I don't believe that that's good enough. I think, you know, our children are human beings. Their individual rights should be upheld like any other kids. And it's not good enough to say, well, that child is an Indigenous and their culture is more important, so therefore we cannot remove them from their culture. We have to keep them in a dysfunctional situation because their culture is their priority. No, that's not what should happen. What should happen is, in terms of true equality, the child's human rights need to be upheld like any other child.
You only family say bit. You a kapit nga naman la. Nampin nga jo kapit ngulang nga jo kap na palela enjer. Na pangadal pa wang ka nga jo kulo. Man yapa pula pajul ngu capra ja. Inyak lang otik lang family. Tret ni man nga jol still yundom laj.
I think it begins with my own experiences of personal violence and sexual assault, and probably not actually gaining closure for my own personal experiences. But also, it's not just my personal experiences, but my mother's personal experiences. And I know that for the both of us, we've not experienced justice, I guess. But there are so many people that I love in the same boat as us who have not experienced justice for what we've endured. And to know that, you know, every so often, it's almost weekly, there's another story that comes out, and another story that comes out, and another story that comes out of a child who's been raped, or a woman that's been killed.
She couldn't walk herself on her 2 feet because she was intoxicated with alcohol plus marijuana, and she didn't know where she was going and walking, and it was like pitch dark, and there'd be like 3 street lights in the community, and most of them are being smashed in that. Yeah, someone got her that night. and raped her and put a rope around her neck. And next day, people were walking around. There's one young boy, one of the boys seen her laying under a baobab tree, and seeing a rope tied up around her neck. And it just don't add up. Like, it's, how can she climb up a tree when she is intoxicated in alcohol, and it's a big baobab tree? It don't make sense, it's a huge baobab tree. And that day, the cops came there, nurses and ambulance and that. I believe that certain people know, been around and heard that had been happened that night. Someone there have witnessed it, but never come forward to talk to the cops.
And quite often with many of these stories, their circumstances have been known. Whether their circumstances have been known to their families, whether their circumstances have been known to the authorities, but their circumstances have been known. And especially when their families have failed them and the authorities haven't stepped in to do what they're supposed to do, well, we've, as a society, failed them.
You've got to build up trust with those families, and it doesn't happen overnight. It's a time thing, and you do it by listening to their stories, by showing them that you do care and you are going to do something about it, and putting the process through court and being there to support them the whole way. You don't just go out, get the story and then it's done. Some of these matters can take 12 months, 18 months, sometimes 2 years to get to court, and you need to be there to support that person the whole way through. You are the familiar face. You're the person that they trusted.
It's really only been since the intervention that these issues have sat at the forefront of the national debate, and that's one thing the intervention has done.
Okay, in the old days you could get away with flogging your woman, and your culture said you could do that, and ours was the same. Our culture told white men we could flog our women too. We've changed. It is totally reasonable to say to somebody, look, keep those elements of your culture that work. Yeah, fine. We could learn from, there's a lot you do that we could learn from. But it's probably about time you change those bits that we've changed in ours, because they don't work anymore. And breaking your wife's arm because she hasn't got a meal on the table for you when you get home, nah, we won't let you do that anymore. And your law has to change if it allows that.
The government's probably just realising, oh, hang on a second, we need to reevaluate everything that we've done. And that should have taken place a long time ago. That you should only be supporting programs and activities that are in fact having an impact, that are in fact working, instead of simply just throwing money at programs for the sake of it, to be seen as trying to do something but not actually doing it.
Yo yanin ngalpa pano support manjak kanda ko.
For Aboriginal women, there's high rates of teenage pregnancy. I'm part of those statistics. I had my eldest when I was 17. My mother was 14 when she had my brother. And it's not uncommon for 14-year-olds to be having kids now. And so for Aboriginal girls, you know, there's still not enough understanding of the importance of education. So teenagers find it very difficult to remain in schools, to remain focused, especially when there isn't, education isn't really highly valued as it should be.
I think that having worked with children for 10 years and now working with adults of domestic and family violence as well as children still, it's about education and empowering women and children and making them feel strong enough to come forward and let them know that it's not okay to be treated in a bad way, and that it is okay to talk about it, and it is okay to walk away, and that there are now supports in place where us and other agencies can assist in ensuring that that can be done in a safe way.
I think it's really important to understand, what's occurred historically. And I think it's important to understand all aspects of it. I was brought up where the last sanctioned massacre to occur in our country's history occurred with my very own people in 1928. And I grew up being able to speak to survivors of that massacre and learning from them. And as a family, we held, when 75 years had passed, we held a commemorative ceremony to recognise our family's loss at that time. But what we did for that commemoration was invite the descendants of those who had killed our family. Because for us, moving forward meant having them be part of moving forward with us, recognising that, saying to them, we don't blame you for the actions, literally because of the actions of your grandfather who killed our people. We understand that in our country's history and at that time, things were very difficult. Life was really hard. We were at war with our traditional enemies. We at times were at war with the white people coming into our country. But we also understood that this change was taking place, and we had to be part of that change in order to survive, in order to continue to thrive, because if you don't, you die. And that ceremony for me, being able to sit there and recognise and hug and hold, those who are the descendants of the killers of our family, is the greatest act of forgiveness and one of the greatest acts of reconciliation that I've ever experienced in this country, because it was meaningful and it was the forgiveness element that I've grown up with understanding is very important in order to progress forward.
In Australia, there seems to be this whole umbrella of, oh, these are all white people, oh, these are all Aboriginal people, these are all Asian people. And I'm saying now that all these individuals are coming through and going, look, I don't fit to this stereotype anymore. I'm not going to be what you want me to be. And I'm telling you that this is what my life is like in this community. How can you argue with that? I don't understand. It's like me saying, well, I grew up in this Filipino community, I grew up in this Whopper community, this white Australian community, and someone goes to me, oh, well, you're really not one of those things because you don't agree with the way that I sit in my head and the way that I've been led to believe about these stereotypes. So I'm like, but you don't know my experience.
This expectation that somehow, the government's going to fix everything for us. It's not going to fix everything for us. It never has. We have to fix things for ourselves, and it starts with us as individuals to do so. And it starts with taking responsibility for oneself. This story, knowing about this, I've known about it for a couple of years, and I really wanted to get to the bottom of it. And the more that I have come to learn about the circumstances around it, about those who have known about it themselves, but I guess felt helpless to do anything about it, the more I've felt, I guess, haunted by her. And just feeling like it's really unfair that that she can just be forgotten about completely. That is so unfair. It's so unfair that her life can be taken and then she can just be forgotten about. And I feel strongly that her spirit is pushing me to find out what's happened to her. To find out what's happened to her, to set the record straight, to set this situation straight.
I would like to see answers. I would like to see families seriously think about doing something about it, and to, try and find her, to find out what really happened to her. That's what I would like to see my family to do, because she was a human being. She was one young woman whose life was taken away too early.
If someone can go missing, a 14-year-old can go missing for 4 decades and be completely forgotten about in that way, it makes me wonder how many other women, Indigenous women, even perhaps men, even perhaps children, have gone missing in that way. When you know things, you can't unknow them. And there's an obligation for me to generate that depth of understanding for my mob, especially when you see particular narratives that are followed when it comes to Indigenous issues in Australia. And when you are aware that the wider Australian community actually know very little about traditional Aboriginal culture, even other Indigenous Australians of different backgrounds who are very, I guess, indistinguishable from other urban Australians, who have, unfortunately for them, lost much of their culture because of the process of colonisation. But even they don't tend to understand traditional Aboriginal culture. And I think it's really important for all Australians to understand, those aspects of Aboriginal culture that lend themselves to, I guess, making the situation harder for Aboriginal people, the most marginalised Aboriginal people, those whose first language is not English, those who are still pretty much connected to their culture, because they are amongst the most marginalised Australians.
And that's what Australia really needs, a big shake-up to go look in your own backyard about what's going on. We're not aliens, we're not separate people, we are Australian people as well, and why don't we take that seriously enough? We should be treated just like everyone else. So if you want to play the racism card, well, you have to believe that Aboriginal people are a certain way and look a certain way and speak a certain way. So if that's the case, then that makes you the racist, because if you want to get rid of racism, you have to meet everyone on an individual basis for individual needs. And we're not doing that. You're saying, oh, just because I talk about my brother, or you're talking about Aboriginal people. No, I'm talking about my brother. Why do we always have to have labels with things? Why can't we just see it as a person who is in a very dangerous situation and help them from that point of view?
We just want, we want to learn Yapa people to learn Kariya people, so we can all stick together as one. So we can all support ourselves, together. Aboriginal and white people, we just stick together and, just work things together as one. So yeah, that's how I wanted it.
It is Aboriginal women who are the majority of victims in terms of the violence that is carried out on our streets. And we still have so far to go in terms of ensuring that Aboriginal women's rights are upheld. We certainly need to dig deeper and be braver and have the courage to really go to those places that make us feel uncomfortable about who we are as individuals, about who we are within our family context, who within our family we should be holding to account for some of the issues that we're confronted with, the violence that we're confronted with, the abuse that we're confronted with, and to acknowledge the truth, but not to allow it to become, fall into violence, if you like. And we're human beings. We're capable of doing that. We just have to be given the opportunity. The right narrative has to be understood. And I don't believe political correctness. I don't believe collective white guilt. Any of those issues are going to help to uncover the truth. Yimi Junga is the term we use when we talk about speaking, but speaking with the truth.